Welcome to Eye on America. I'm Michelle Miller. Today we travel from coast to coast for a look at Americans going against the grain to make change. From a nonprofit honoring our nation's heroes by helping veterans find employment after service, to former NFL players on a mission to promote education and erase the stigma around cannabis. But we begin with a new Department of Justice office specifically designed to help the victims of violent crimes. Jeff Begays has the report.
Losing a loved one to murder is the worst thing that could ever happen to anybody.
Sergeant Ben Brown solves homicides in Prince George's County, Maryland.
I never thought it would touch me in my personal life.
In 2020, the senseless violence he usually fights in the streets hit home for him and his wife, Donna. Their 17-year-old son, Bradley, was gunned down steps from their house. Police say Bradley was selling THC vape cartridges when his killers tried to rob him, and he died in the family's driveway.
I go out there almost every day, and I have the thoughts of him laying there.
With rising crime and homicides in cities and towns across America, more victims and families are faced with grief that the legal system is often unable to heal. 50% of all homicides across the country went unsolved in 2020, and even for the cases that are cracked, the road to justice can still be painfully long. One of the men involved in Bradley's death has been sentenced to life in prison, but another suspect goes on trial later this year, more than 2 years after the crime. Do you think at times victims are forgotten in this talk about rise in crime across the country?
Unfortunately, all too frequently.
Assistant Attorney General Kenneth Polite leads the Justice Department's criminal division. This year, his office has brought in its first victim rights coordinator.
The reality is that the criminal justice system often doesn't provide enough. I can't bring back a loved one to a family, no matter what sentence the criminal justice system imposes.
Polite grew up in New Orleans' Lower Ninth Ward. He is a prosecutor who sees violent crime through the eyes of law enforcement and victims.
I lost my half-brother to the streets of New Orleans very violently as well.
Growing up, his family kept him on track. He credits a mother who was dedicated to his success and a father who was a 37-year veteran of the New Orleans Police Department. But Polite says his half-brother's murder is why he's working at the Justice Department.
I think his death in a lot of ways shaped me and led me to want to become a prosecutor.
Polite says victims are at the center of the work that his office is doing. The criminal division is updating its victim policies and procedures, including possible legislative changes to victims' rights statutes. Do you have the resources that you need?
We could absolutely use more to ensure that we are bringing those victims into our work as early as possible, making sure that our decision-making is being informed by their interests. He says mistrust of police by minority communities is one of the hurdles he's trying to tackle. I've seen the worst of law enforcement. I've seen what it means for victims not to come forward. I've seen what it means for witnesses not willing to come into a courtroom to support our cases, which can often lead to delayed prosecutions, as was the case for Polite's family.
It took about 10 years for your family to get justice.
Some sliver of justice, I would say. Sergeant Ben Brown says the most important thing for all victims is to not give up the hope for justice.
There are things you can do to promote the case and try and get justice.
You're telling people to keep the pressure on people like you who investigate these cases.
Absolutely. You have to. You don't want them to ever forget.
Just a short trip to Washington, D.C. for our next story, the challenge many of our nation's heroes face when returning to civilian life. Only 1 in 4 veterans have a job lined up after leaving the military. CBS Evening News anchor Nora O'Donnell visits a nonprofit aimed to ease that transition.
Launching into a new career after the military is difficult, even for a 2-star general with decades of service like Dusty Schultz.
How hard is that transition?
It's pretty tough.
Major General Schultz speaks multiple languages, but there's one she's still trying to learn.
In the military, we have our own terminology. I work in the G357, and to most people, that doesn't mean much.
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
But if I tell somebody, you know, I work in the operations center of the Army, that means a lot.
Translating their skills to corporate language is only one of the issues service members face.
What do you think will be the hardest part of transitioning to civilian life?
Taking off the uniform and realizing that I have a new uniform, a new purpose.
Enter American Corporate Partners, an organization that works with veterans to find that purpose through a network of mentors. A study found 53% of veterans are unemployed for 4 months or longer after leaving the military. The ones we talked to cite a lack of resources, underemployment, and not having a 4-year degree as some of the obstacles.
I really thought that it was going to be a little bit easier to be able to find a job.
The group helped First Sergeant Manny Morejon Reyes. He served over 20 years as an aviation senior leader.
I concentrated my career on giving everything to the military. Most of job descriptions do require you to have some sort of level of higher education.
He says because he didn't have a 4-year degree, his applications were overlooked before T-Mobile hired him as a human resources manager.
Why should private corporations want to hire veterans?
A lot of veterans have soft skills that most of corporate America takes years to attain. Loyalty, integrity, honesty, and a great work ethic.
They have the discipline. Sometimes they have just these phenomenally exquisite skills. And why are we not harnessing that?
Do you think the corporate world is waking up to that?
Oh, yes. We still want to give the best of ourselves and to be part of something bigger than ourselves, as we've talked about, just being part of the team.
After the break, we explore the many virtues Mother Nature has to offer. This is Eye on America. Now we dig deep to uncover an unusual type of farming with surprising benefits. John Larritson from CBS Minnesota introduces us to a couple who found a passion for harvesting worms.
They look really good for this age. These are only about 6 weeks old.
Mike and Karen Larson have a nursery on their property, one that contains thousands of baby worms.
If you'd have told me I would have been a worm farmer 5 years ago, I would have laughed at you.
Now he probably knows more than he ever wanted to. When the Larsons retired a few years ago, they moved from the Twin Cities to central Minnesota. Mike got a little bored, so he decided to become a farmer.
It's a different kind of livestock.
Different kind of livestock. It's you know, there's similarities. We got to take care of our young, and then they put off a lot of heat.
These aren't the type of worms you use to catch walleyes. They are night crawlers from Africa.
Ooh, that's mushy. Look at that.
The Larsons sell the worm castings. It's what these slimy invertebrates leave behind. And when put in the soil, plants eat it up.
It's the fecal matter of the worm. It's like a probiotic for your soil. And so we kind of felt like we'd be helping people if they could eat healthier.
There are more than 6,000 African night crawlers in each bin and about 250 bins in this facility.
If you're doing the math at home, that's more than 1 million wiggling worms. Several times a week, harvesting takes place. Bins full of night crawlers are run through a machine called a trommel. It separates the castings from the cocoons and the worms. Then the night crawlers go for a bit of a ride, like the world's smallest cliff divers. For the Larsons, the early bird definitely gets the worm. They and their crew put in long hours, which is why they're always looking for a little help.
If this TV thing doesn't work out, I got a future.
There you go, that's right.
We stay in the soil for the next story on the power of plants and the medical benefits most don't know about cannabis. 19 states have legalized recreational marijuana use, and nearly 40 have cleared it for medical use. Nate Burleson sat down with retired NFL stars Calvin Johnson and Rob Sims, who are on a mission to erase the stigma around cannabis.
Do you believe that athletes, not just in the NFL, but across all professional sports, do you believe that they smoke?
100%, absolutely.
Calvin Johnson understands that football changed his life.
From the 17, looking for Megatron, and
That's a touchdown.
But the 36-year-old NFL Hall of Famer says cannabis helped change how he now lives his life.
To the NFL, college football, and all major sports, including the Olympics, it's also time we recognize the potential of phytomedicines, plant medicines, to aid and improve the mental health and quality of life for so many.
Some of the best players in the world.
I'm not going to name any names, but some of the best players in the world.
That's a fact. That's a fact. I mean, listen, at one point, you're the best receiver in the world. It's not even a question.
See, all I got to say is you the best in the business. Yeah, right. I've been trying to keep quiet, stay political about this.
And you were a cannabis user.
Yes.
And you weren't a pothead. I don't think anybody in the world would describe Calvin Johnson as that. When somebody's like, well, when I think of weed usage, I think of this person.
We need 2 big pieces, man.
That right there, I think that's what continues the taboo and the stigma. These images that have been burned into our minds of what a user of cannabis looks like.
It's hard to rehab from that.
It's hard to rehab from that.
All right, so these are the babies?
These are the babies.
At this cannabis grow facility, 1 hour outside of Detroit, retired NFL stars Calvin Johnson and Rob Sims are trying to help erase the stigma of cannabis use.
We harvest them in about 63 days or so.
63 days.
Then we harvest them, and then they go into our dry room, and then from there it's probably another 10 or so days till they're ready to go. Yep.
Rotate that to the right.
Primitive, their cannabis company, is in the early stages of their partnership with Harvard University to help study the causes and effects of the traumatic brain injury known as CTE and help those suffering from chronic pain.
So as we were sitting in the locker room back in Detroit, would you have thought that you guys would be the leaders of a cannabis brand?
I wasn't thinking about cannabis when I was in the locker room. It was not even on the horizon. They don't know the healing powers of the plant.
Both Johnson and Sims view cannabis as a healing agent, and they see their company and its product as a potential alternative to opioid pain medications, which have been abused in the U.S. for years. According to figures released by the CDC, last year, drug overdose deaths topped 100,000 for the first time in American history, and more than 3/4 of those overdose deaths were from opioids.
Cannabis is not only a potential treatment for chronic pain, it's a very effective treatment for chronic pain that millions of people are currently employing.
Harvard Medical School instructor and physician at Massachusetts General Hospital, Dr. Peter Grinspoon.
More and more studies are coming in. A lot of them just hadn't been funded by the US government because of the war on drugs. They only studied harms and not benefits. There are millions of people that are using it for chronic pain, and they're reporting an improved quality of life over opiates.
I remember having doctors prescribe me like Vicodin. I remember the directions saying, take when you have pain. But here I am, a football player who's torn my pec, and I just thought it wasn't good for me to sit at home and pop pills.
I initially started using cannabis in college, but really didn't become a frequent user until I got into the NFL when the injuries started to pile up. And that was really what it was for. I mean, it helped with the sleep, but really just to overall improve my quality of life. I had to be there for whether it was my family, my teammates, and the weight that we have to carry, and to be able to compartmentalize, it was something that helped me, be able to de-stress.
I'm curious to see if you can recall the injuries you have had in your career.
We've all had concussions. We played this great sport, both shoulders, no surgeries there, just injured shoulders, obviously fingers, ugly fingers, surgeries. Knee, just one surgery there, but sprains in both of the knees, ankles, sprains all the way down, contusions, just the, normal life of a football player.
The NFL seems to be listening. Earlier this year, the league donated $500,000 to UC San Diego's Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research to study whether the plant can be used to help athletes manage pain. Johnson and Sims both believe their product will help improve lives.
That came out really good.
Yeah, that's probably the best I've ever seen us do that right now.
Why do you believe cannabis can be a great form of healing?
For me personally, I've dealt with opioids, and for me, just a sense of balance is just off. I try to stay away from anything synthetic.
They dry for about 10 days or so.
And cannabis is a natural substance.
When it comes to the NBA, NFL, NHL, Major League Baseball, across all the sports, really, there have been a lot of athletes coming out and being very honest about their cannabis use. Why do you believe that is?
I just think it's a new day, right? Cannabis has become legal in these different, states, and it's progressing to the rest of the country. The conversation has begun to change, and it's become more acceptable. I think all athletes see it as an avenue for an alternative healing other than opioids.
Coming up, we look at a controversial approach corralling wild horses in the American West. With the help of modern technology, thousands of Mustangs living across the western states are getting round up by the federal government. But not everyone thinks it's a tame approach. Joy Benedict takes us on the range to see how.
It is a calm that's blanketed this hillside since the West was won. But just after dawn on this summer day in the high desert of Northern California, it was the hum of machine that sliced through the silence. On the range, this is the sound of controversy for man and Mustang.
Some horses here in Twin Peaks were raised on the range for the U.S. Cavalry.
Jeff Fontana has been working these lands for more than 30 years with the Federal Bureau of Land Management. It's charged with caring for America's wild horses.
They're living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West.
But with an estimated 82,000 of them running free in 10 states, this year alone, the Bureau, known as BLM, is tasked with slimming the herds by 20,000 horses and burros.
We've been using helicopters for most of the program. And really, helicopters are a safe and efficient way to move large numbers of animals across the landscape.
As the chopper descends on a group of horses, it pushes in, pulls back, pushes in again, eventually corralling them into a trap.
But how dangerous is this for them?
Well, injuries occur. You know, we're talking about wild horses, wild animals that have never been around humans. But our track record is really good in this program. Injuries resulting in death from our gather activities are less than 1/2%.
But of course, you have to understand how traumatizing or sad it is for the public to see you lose any horse.
Sure. It's also a situation we're trying to avoid, losing horses on the range due to degraded resources.
And while it's hard to imagine the overpopulation of anything out here, that's what the BLM says is happening.
We try and keep the herd at the right size, or else we're going to have animals that don't have food to eat or water to drink.
Jason Leuterman works for the National Horse and Burro Program. It's operating 46 roundups in the West this year, including this one in California.
Wild horse and burro herds increase at 15 to 20% a year. If we weren't here to manage that growth, the herds will keep growing. Eventually, they will degrade the land enough to where they will run out of food and water.
So you're basically saying that you manage the herd to keep the herd?
That's exactly right. Yep. Our goal is to manage healthy herds on healthy public lands. And so the way we can do that is to make sure that there's enough resources out here for those animals to survive.
The BLM manages 26.9 million acres of land, established in the 1940s to oversee and preserve federal lands and lease them for lucrative livestock grazing. But when wild Mustangs started being hunted, Congress passed the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burro Act in 1971 to protect them and the land they live on.
The charge of the government, the BLM, is to humanely manage, and there's nothing humane about what's going on.
Congresswoman Dina Titus, a Democrat from Nevada, has initiated a formal review of what the BLM is doing.
It wasn't until some of the activist groups started tracking those roundups and taking video of them that I realized just how horrendous they are. They use helicopters, they run horses down.
She also introduced a bill to ground the choppers, which last year were used in roundups where 25 horses died. She says there may be a more humane method.
They charge a high rate. I say if you don't use helicopters, you can hire a cowboy. So save a horse and hire a cowboy. They know how to round up horses, and I'm sure it's more humane than this.
The Bureau of Land Management spent more than $450 million in the last 5 years on its wild horse and burro program. $25 million went to gathering animals, but most of the money goes to caring for horses in long-term captivity.
Unadopted animals are cared for long-term in what we call off-range pastures. These are big open grasslands for these animals to roam for the rest of their lives. And yes, it does cost about 60% of our budget to care for the unadopted and unsold animals.
And although the horses are up for adoption, that program is drawing concern as well, as the BLM only monitors adopted horses for the first year.
We don't place them in private ownership if we believe that people have the intent to sell them for slaughter, and we try to monitor that as best we can.
But still, it does happen.
It's happened. You know, I can't deny that those kinds of things have happened. It's something that we're acutely aware of and always on top of.
And as for using cowboys to round up Mustangs, they stopped doing that back in the 70s.
And I've talked to people who worked in the program prior to the use of helicopters, and moving horses from horseback was just a really, really difficult situation.
But on this morning, the Bureau of Land Management collected 46 horses, including 6 foals. Most of the animals were sent to temporary holding facilities, except 2. A vet euthanized them for poor health. And although a handful of these horses will receive birth control and be released, the rest will now live a domestic life off the range and away from the land that once made them wild and free.
Now we travel to Connecticut to visit a children's camp serving a special purpose, welcoming kids from around the world who have survived life-altering burn injuries. Nancy Chin has the story.
The only target for these campers, simply getting to be kids.
We've been through so much in our lives.
13-year-old Haley is one of dozens of survivors who gather for a week every July at the Arthur C. Luff Burn Camp. It's her 6th time here.
Why do you keep coming back to camp?
This is my second home, and it allows us to socialize with people that are just like us.
When you're in other places, sometimes people tend to stare. Here, it's like you're all the same.
Now in its 31st year, the Connecticut camp is free and staffed entirely by volunteers, including former campers like Kathy Wright.
Do you think that you would be where you are today if it wasn't for this camp?
Not at all. I wore turtlenecks all over the place. I didn't value myself until I came in and I saw others who had more self-confidence.
These campers call it a community born of understanding.
When I was younger, I got bullied, but as soon as I hit this camp, my attitude just changed, my personality changed. I feel it made me a better person than what I was when I first came here.
It may look like fun and games, but this camp is also a real game changer.
I did it!
For more stories like these and live coverage of breaking news 24/7, stream us right here on CBS News. I'm Michelle Miller. Thank you for watching Eye on America.